Democracy Project would like to thank everyone for coming today. A few things about Julene is that she grew up in western Kansas. She graduated from the University of Iowa with 2 writing degrees, master degrees. She's won several writing awards, one of them which is the Fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts, and she's also the author of 2 books, both of them which were set in western Kansas. The one that she just recently published is the Ogallala Road from Viking Penguin, and then the other one that she's published is 1 Degree West, A Reflection of a Plains Daughter. Also, there's some free lunch still over there if you guys are interested in that. And then she's also selling her new book that she just published, so if you're interested in that, we would like for you guys to take a look at that. So now I'll let Julene take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan Lawrence and the American Democracy Project for having me here today. It's really an honor to be invited to give a Times talk. I'm especially happy that I'm here in western Kansas where I feel more at home, even though it's cold as the dickens outside. When I was walking over here this morning, I was grateful that I wasn't a schoolgirl back in, I won't tell you what year, I don't want to date myself too much, when we always had to wear skirts to school, and I would wait for the bus in the morning and my poor legs would freeze. Now it's okay to wear pants, so I appreciate that. I've been speaking a lot in eastern Kansas, and this is as far west as I've managed to get. I'm getting into my own home territory now, so that's exciting to me. I think I might be talking to some people who know a little bit more about the Ogallala Aquifer than the people in eastern Kansas, some of whom have never heard the word before, Ogallala. So how many of you happen to be from the actual aquifer region? That's really wonderful that I am talking to people who know more about this topic. It's a very prominent theme in my book, as you can tell from the title. The Ogallala Road refers to the Ogallala Aquifer. The subtitle of my book is a memoir of love and reckoning. So it's also a very personal book. It unfolds like a novel. It's told in story form with dialogue and a number of dramatic scenes. And the story of the Ogallala Aquifer is woven throughout that book. Normally when I give talks or readings, I read from some of those dramatic scenes. I'm probably not going to get into that very much today. Don't really have time for it because this is a Times talk, and we're supposed to be talking about an issue that has appeared in the New York Times. As a matter of fact, the Ogallala Aquifer has appeared in the New York Times often. It's not that often, really, that Kansas topics do hit the Times. But the fact that it is covered frequently in the Times gives us a sense of the national and even world significance of this giant aquifer. It's the largest aquifer in North America. And whatever happens to it happens to the world, in essence. The most recent article that I wanted to kind of hone in just a little bit today, and I can see already that many of you are not going to be able to read these bottom words, was an article by Michael Wines in May 2013, in which he informed us of what many of us already know, that this is a slow motion crisis, decades in the making. Thanks to the aquifer, farmers in that region who irrigate are able to produce nearly twice as much corn, 2/3 more soybeans, and 3/5 more wheat than they used to be able to produce with just dryland farming. But vast stretches of Texas farmland lying over the aquifer no longer support irrigation. In west central Kansas, up to 1/5 of the irrigated farmland along a 100-mile swath of the aquifer has already gone dry. As far as maps of the aquifer go, I actually prefer this more creative rendering of the aquifer. You can't actually see the aquifer, and I think that's one of the problems facing the aquifer, because you can't really see it. You don't really understand how much trouble it's really in. But this gives you a sense of what it really is, which is a circulatory system for the planet. it's appropriate that there are no man-made boundaries here because the aquifer has been there for 4 million years. It's a geologic formation that's saturated with water. It's not just an underground lake. It's like a sponge of sands and gravels and rock and so on. And in the spaces between those sediments, there is water. It also shows you where the water is more concentrated in the aquifer. You don't hear very much about surface water when you hear about the crisis facing the aquifer. But in fact, every river and creek on the high plains, with the exception of the Arkansas and the Platte, are solely fed by the Ogallala Aquifer. It's spring water that comes up into those creeks and rivers. And in fact, the Ogallala also feeds the Platte and the Arkansas somewhat. But the problem is that those springs and rivers are drying up because as the aquifer is drawn down, the surface water is disappearing. And that surface water has supported mankind for 13,000 years, going all the way back to when the Clovis culture was on the plains. This is a picture of me wading in what is left of the Republican River. This was in 2004. And I'm always blissful whenever I find water on the plains. I'm a real water nut, a water fanatic. Coming from a dry place, I think that's why. But I was also a little disappointed because that river used to flow very high in my childhood. I'm showing you this picture now, however, because at the end of my talk I'm going to show you another picture which I think of the Republican River in that area, which I think may surprise you somewhat. I want to read just a portion from the beginning of the book so you get a sense of what my personal stake is in the aquifer question. And a sip of the water that froze in my car this morning, I had to thaw it out. These were called the high plains because they were 4,000 feet above sea level. I could feel the altitude and the way the sun sheeted my skin. It was like standing too close to a fire with no means of escaping, unless I dashed back to the car and switched on the air conditioner. Instead, I trudged through wheat stubble that used to be the south end of our pasture, my shoes filling with powdery dirt, and my socks with stickers. This western Kansas land belonged to the Carlsons, my mother's side of the family. When I was 16, my parents traded their share in it for land elsewhere in the county. Like many other successful farmers, they built a new house in town. More than 3 decades had passed since then. Although I knew there wouldn't be water in the creek here, I wanted to walk down its dry bed as I had in childhood, picking up every shiny piece of agate I saw, hoping to discover an arrowhead. In the dry places, men begin to dream, wrote Wright Morris, who grew up north of here in Nebraska. Where rivers run sand, something in man begins to flow. I thought I knew exactly what he meant. The sandy beds of dry creeks unfurl evocatively into the beckoning distance, inscribing their faint script over the land. They entice the exploring spirit. But when I arrived at the Little Beaver, I discovered that the creek was now nothing more than a depression. Runoff from all the newly farmed pasture land had filled it with silt. Weeds grew where there had once been smooth sand, vacant and pinkish tan. In my childhood, the sand had poured sensuously through my hands, each granule having its own color, shape, size, sheen. Our sense of beauty is a survival instinct, telling us that a place can sustain us for generations to come. I'd always known this in my bones, but it wasn't until many years after I left Kansas and discovered my passion for wilderness that the intuition became conscious. This creek was now ugly. That didn't bode well for the underlying aquifer's ability to support life in the future. Rain and snowmelt couldn't filter into the ground as efficiently through dirt as they could through sand. and sandy creek bottoms were critical to the meager half-inch of recharge that the aquifer received each year. It needed all it could get because irrigation farmers were allowed to pump 40 times that amount. At least the north end of the pasture remained in grass. Standing here as a child, I often pretended that this was the original Kansas, pre-us. The low-growing grass stitched itself over the ground like a woolly tapestry, accented, especially in the spring, by other pastels. Blue grama grass, apricot mallow, the yellow and cream waxen blooms of cactus and yucca. Prairie dogs chirped alarms from mounds of whitish clay, and meadowlarks sang from their perches on yucca spires, their notes climbing and dipping like winding ribbons. Instead of cows, I imagined buffalo grazing the hills. The grass had been named after the buffalo because millions of them once thrived on it. We called this our canyon pasture because the creek had carved some cliffs into the otherwise smooth terrain. The canyon was really no more than an interruption in the earth, as my mother called it, but it was the wildest topography in this part of the county. The Little Beaver made a horseshoe turn here. Our old windmill stood on the spit of land formed by the bend. When I paid visits to the canyon as a child, my father's ewes and their lambs would be drinking out of the low troughs. They would scatter as I approached, their hooves sounding like water rippling over rock. But today, only a few cattle grazed the hill above the canyon, moving in and out of the shadows of cumulus clouds. I used to climb the windmill and sit up there for what seemed like hours, transfixed by the shadows. They might have been cast by lily pads or boats on the bottom of a lake. From that height, I could also see our big house's red roof rising above a shelter belt of elms. But if I climbed the windmill's narrow ladder today, I knew too well that I would not see our roof, or even the trees. My grandfather Carlson had built the house high on a knoll. With stately trees and a huge red barn beside it, it had been a landmark, visible for miles around. Now, it was as if all evidence of our existence had been erased by the wand-like arm of the center pivot irrigation sprinkler I parked beside. Like all the sprinklers that circled these plains, this one was made from a quarter mile of pipe strung between steel towers. Along the pipe's length, hoses hung down with spigots on the ends, spraying a uniform mist over a 130-acre circle of 6-foot-tall, fully tasseled corn. I could hear the pump engines growl, pulsating on the morning's mounting heat. It hadn't been like this in the mid-60s when we left this place. It had been quiet then. But now, in this second year of the new millennium, you couldn't escape that sound on the high plains. Our current farm, only about 10 miles from here as the crow flew, was no exception. We had 5 irrigation wells, some of which ran all day and all night during the growing season. We drew the water from the most plentiful source of groundwater in the country. The Ogallala Aquifer was the hope and promise at the center of the nation, the source of life that had made habitation possible for millions of years before the words United States, or any words for that matter, had been coined. On geologists' maps, it was roughly the shape of a tornado, wide at the top where it lay under parts of South Dakota, Wyoming, and Nebraska, and narrowing to a funnel in Texas where farmers had been irrigating longer. The maps indicated depletion rates in colors ranging from blue in much of Nebraska, where water was still plentiful, to brown and almost black in some parts of Kansas and North Texas, meaning gone, pumped dry, or at least to below usable levels. Those dark freckles of high decline were spreading like cancers, gradually enlarging and taking over hundreds of square miles. The windmills fan whirred and the well rods creaked up and down, making a tinny, lonely sound. Water spurted from the pipe into a tank. These, not the growl of irrigation engines, were the sounds I equated with water while growing up. The rhythm was systolic, soothing. I washed my arms and face in the transparent rope, which fattened and thinned as the windmill breathed. I drank. The best water in the world, Mom used to say. She was right. Going down my throat, it felt as cold and bright as the sunlight was hot and bright. The reason I was out there that day is I wanted to trace the course of the dry bed of the Little Beaver Creek toward its outlet in the Republican River. I had read that there used to be springs in that creek bed, and that the Native Americans used to camp there, that the Cheyenne Indians, for instance, had held sun dances there. And I felt that I had a lot personally at stake in whether or not I did find water that day, because it would be commentary on the price that the land had paid for my own family's comfort. As it turned out, I got lucky, and I did find a creek that day, a little Ogallala fed spring. Whoops, got ahead of myself. I don't know how that happened exactly. This is not that spring that I found. It's another picture that a friend of mine took of another spring, but it's very much like the one I found that day. And it was very exciting to see it. This was water coming to the surface of its own accord, just appearing as if magically in that very dry, hot place. But it was hot, so I got up out of the creek bed, crawled up out of it, and sat under the shade of a cottonwood tree. And shortly after that, I heard this very familiar sound. It was the sound of, from my childhood, a pickup coming down the hill, pulling an empty metal stock trailer. And out of this pickup stepped this man who, I soon learned, even though I didn't know him from Adam, had read my first book. And that was very amazing for me to hear, because no one, except for maybe my second grade and my freshman English teacher, in my awareness, had read my book in Sherman County, and my mother. So a conversation ensued, and it turned out we had a lot of common interests in Native Americans and in the grasslands. And the man kind of appealed to me because he was a grass man or a rancher, not a dirt man or a farmer like my parents had been. I also had a 16-year-old son who had never known his father and had always longed for a father. And so there were several things that attracted me to this man. But most of all, I think what attracted me to him was the fact that my own family's relationship to our land was under threat. I didn't fully understand that then. It hadn't quite entered my consciousness. But I think that I thought that this man might help us save the family farm. Anyway, that story unfolds in the book, and that's the last you're going to hear about it today. I want you to hear what that windmill sounded like. To me, that sound is very evocative of home, of the high plains. This is the canyon hill above the Little Beaver on our farm. It's a picture I took last August. And if you look at the rock up in the top corner there, this is my mother standing on that very same rock in 1938 when she was 19 years old. Here's the house that I would have seen the roof of had it still been there when I climbed the windmill out in that pasture. Here's the barn. The blurry man in front of it, I think, is my grandfather, but I'm not sure. This is my mother standing in the veritable oasis that she created using Ogallala water. None of the gardens or lawns or windbreaks in western Kansas would exist were it not for Ogallala water. I cut out the part about my brothers in that first section, but this is my brother Clark, the oldest on the left. By the time this book began, he had died. And it was going to be up to my brother Bruce and me as to whether or not we were going to be able to honor our father's first commandment, which was hang on to your land. So, and that was getting less easy now that my father was dead, and the man who had been farming the land for us was elderly and ill. We were going to have to make some major sacrifices, make some sorts of decisions. We weren't sure what just yet. Here's another example of what life was like on the farm in a more sense-around sort of presentation. I always like to, this sounded like another bow over there. I always like to play this sound because it brings back other sensory sensations. If you've ever been around livestock, maybe you could smell them. Or even the lanolin on the coats had a distinctive smell. The feel of the wool and just sort of the whole enmeshed, interwoven, integrated kind of existence that you have on a farm that has livestock and many different kinds of crops and many different kinds of domestic and even wild creatures. This is my father when he was graduating from Colorado State University. He was one of only 7 siblings, he was one of 7, the only one of 7 siblings to go to college. But what he chose to study there was agriculture. He said because all he ever wanted to do was farm. He said that often. The land that he had grown up on and that he was now farming had actually made him who he was. But that was too sentimental a statement for him. He would never have said such a thing himself. Here he is in a wheat field. He was very practiced, as were all of our neighbors, in the art and science of farming where rainfall is deficient. That is the historian Walter Prescott Webb's definition of dryland farming. It meant nurturing the moisture in your soil, fallowing your ground every other year, doing all sorts of other things to make sure that you preserve the moisture in your soil. And at this level, in my childhood, we were sort of at a plateau. We were prosperous farmers. We were doing all right. Most of our neighbors were prosperous. Everyone was doing all right. But my father was not of the same cultural background as the Hopi Indians, for instance. And this is just a picture of a random Hopi I was able to find on the web. But when I was a young adult, I was able to visit the Hopevilla village in northern Arizona. And at that time, they were waging a big battle against the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who wanted to drill a well in Hopevilla, which was the most traditional village, and put a water tower up in the village. They thought they were doing them a favor, but it was a favor they didn't want because they were quite certain that if they had an abundance of water, they would use it up. They would use it more than they did presently, and the spring that they had walked down to gather their water for 600 years would dry up. So they had a totally different cultural attitude toward living in the desert. And they had a spiritual understanding that it was a good thing to live in the desert because then you knew your limits. You could not go beyond those limits. In the 1940s, it became possible to draw water out of the ground at a sufficient rate to irrigate crops on the high plains. Irrigation development really didn't hit full swing in my part of the state, which is the northwestern part, until the 1960s. So lacking that kind of cultural understanding that says you need to husband your water if you want to, or steward it if you want to have it around forever. My father heard the call of the Ogallala siren. I really love this painting because it just shows you just how truly enticing the water was to the farmers, how seductive it was. What she's holding in her left hand is a glass of drinking water. What she's holding in her right hand, to some people, looks like a straw hat. So I'm going to just inform you it's not a straw hat, it's a hamburger, right? Which is appropriate because if you know where the Kansas corn crop goes, I mean, the entire Kansas corn crop does not go to beef cattle, but the equivalent of the entire Kansas corn crop does go to beef cattle in Kansas. I don't blame my father for making that decision. He had grown up in very hard times. He'd grown up in a sod house. Everything looked like progress to him. Each new advancement was an opportunity to make a better life for himself and his family. And it was what everyone else was doing. But it is shameful to me, sad, super sad, that this is what our farmstead looks like today, where all that life took place. This is what's there now. And this is what the land in western Kansas looks like today. Those gray-green areas are the buffalo grass pastures. That's all that's left of them. And the only reason they're there, for the most part, is because they're too rugged to farm. So these changes in the way we were farming and the fact that we moved to town changed my family's psychology. Whoops, I'm supposed to have a black screen there, so you're going to have to just stare at that ugly picture while I read you just another really short excerpt. In fact, they made it possible for my brothers and me, or for my brother and me, to consider selling our farm. I don't think that would have been possible otherwise. There were actually two constructs, and they'd always been in opposition. The conscious one of ourselves as landowners and our unconscious connection to the land. On the Carlson farm, we'd all been part of a tapestry, a weave. There were animals and grains, vegetables and prairie, trees and people, play and work, mud and stars, the scents of manure and of flowers. I choose these things at random, and it doesn't matter what order I list them in. A specific list of the 10,000 things, to use a phrase from the Tao Te Ching, would fill many pages. They were all entangled, of a piece. But when we traded that farm and moved to town, then when I left Kansas altogether, I became a lone thread. While I was trying to weave myself back into the natural world in the mountains and deserts of California, my family's relationship with our land back home was continuing to unravel. Dad drove to it every day. He didn't live on it. Its meaning had shifted from the seat of our family's life to solely a source of revenue. Dad's success growing crops still affirmed and satisfied him, but his land had become more of a thing to him and to us. It had become a financial asset, not who we were. It is no mistake that we use the same word in English to denote both financial worth and a moral principle we hold dear. In one line of reasoning, if we sold, we'd actually be obeying our Father's value system, even if doing so would violate his first precept. Selling seemed to be the best financial decision. We are told often when we hear about the Aquifer, about the billions of dollars in revenue that it generates. And this is certainly true. But we don't think about the ecosystem that was there before we started generating this revenue. We don't really think about the long term. And I think Western Kansas are not necessarily as beauty conscious of their landscape as, say, people who live in the mountains or people who live along the coastlines are. Grasslands are undervalued in this country, really. But one early Plains person really loved the Plains, as did many people, and his name was Richard I. Dodge, the man that Dodge City was named after. He coined the phrase magnificence of being to describe the feeling that inhabited him when he rode out onto the empty plains. So in this book, I'm trying to awaken memories of what that place was once like. And I dare to suggest that it was actually a beautiful place, and that what is left of it is still worth preserving, and that it is itself of inestimable value. And then indeed, our sense of beauty is a survival instinct. I am still looking for the really great buffalo grass prairie shot. I haven't found one. This is the one I took on my phone, but still that's far more beautiful to me than the land carved into circles and squares. Think about if you lived in Colorado in a mountain town and every tree in the mountains for miles and hundreds of miles around you had been cut down. Would you have sat still for that? do you think? And would you realize in your bones almost that that was a threat to the rivers, to the fisheries, to the wildlife habitat, and the ability of that place to sustain generations to come? You'd know it. You'd know that in your bones, and you would refuse to let that happen. But that's what we in Kansas have let happen to our landscape. I believe that all who live and farm there do feel this conflict between financial gain and a more integrated and sensible way of life. And that's illustrated in this brief passage that I want to read. You cannot grow up climbing windmills to gaze at sunsets or trekking through pastures rattling grain buckets in pursuit of intractable horses and not see the beauty or regret its passing, even if, like my family and me, you've had a hand in the destruction. Honest ideas expressed in the national press seep into local minds like sunlight through gaps in clouds. In Kansas, the gaps are between the way things used to be and the way they are now. Not only did deer and antelope really once play there, but instead of outgassing poison after being infused with ammonia fertilizer, dirt used to smell sweet in the spring. Nights were silent and skies were dark. Water didn't gush from the earth as from a cut artery. And as one Goodlandite told me, we used to get snow. We no more and get one little finger in the winter, a little blow, and that's about it. It stays too warm. This was a friend of my parents, who, like my father, grew up in a sod house. His wife, a petite dynamo who used to lead the Prairie Dusters, a rodeo drill team I belonged to as a teenager, said, the weather patterns had changed. These two were mainly cattle ranchers, although they also farmed and had once run sheep. They always seemed the picture of Western glamour to me. She with her cute Western bell-bottoms and sexy lace-fringed Western blouses. He, a tall, handsome cowboy who wore a big hat and shiny boots. When I called and told them I was writing about the Ogallala, they had little choice but to meet with me. I was Harold and Jasmine's daughter, but that didn't mean they had to go along with any liberal claptrap. The man sat across from me in my mother's living room, his legs folded and his hat hanging off one knee. Hell no, he'd answered when I asked him if it saddened him that we'd plowed up much of the prairie. Baloney to the good old days. Outside toilets, freezing your butt off. Look at you, Julie. You're sitting in a pretty nice chair. You're not out in a teepee somewhere, weaving wool. Now that the conversation had moved on to weather patterns, I could still feel the couple's resistance to my environmental notions, but I was driven to transcend the polarity that too often made genuine communication impossible. Did they think changes in the weather were another cycle, I asked, or part of a general trend? A cycle, he said. He sounded irritated, ready to go home. I think it's a general trend, she said more carefully. Is it the greenhouse effect, I asked? He stammered. I don't know if it's the greenhouse. He surprised me then by launching into a spiel that, accepting the diction, might have come out of my own mouth. You know, technology's great, but we've gone too far. We can kill bugs, we can kill weeds, we can kill everything, but every time we kill something else. Just like the wildlife out here, it ain't hard to see we're starving the pheasants to death when we spray our stubble after harvest. Spray it clean. Well, that's what the chicks lived on. And besides that, when they're picking up some of that chemical and they're eating it. And I'm not a big environmentalist either. Technology has allowed us to grow lots of crop, but it's also technology that's sending us backwards on the other side. Every time you put out fertilizer or chemical, you know it's gonna rain someday and it's gonna run off, it's gonna get into the creek somewhere. If this conservative friend of my father's knew this, I figure everyone does. It's just that few are as willing to admit to problems with technologies they've always viewed as progress. as long as he raised the quality issue. I wrote about this myself in the New York Times in an editorial. And there is atrazine and fertilizers showing up in the wells in western Kansas. And all over the high plains, all over the Ogallala region. It's trickling down because the entire area is being sprayed with herbicides and fertilizers every year. And if you want to read more about that, you can just Google my name and New York Times and it'll come up. It's called Running Dry on the Great Plains. And also, speaking of economics, it costs $4.8 billion to clean the nitrates out of the nation's drinking water each year. And we're not really succeeding. There are many of what we call externalities that don't, there are costs that don't appear on the profit and loss statement of the farmers and business people who are making their livings from this practice. Healthcare costs, fisheries destroyed, the dead zone in the Gulf that we've all heard a lot about, topsoil loss to continuous cropping. This picture is a really extreme example of that. This is just a dryland, I believe, cornfield out in western Kansas that I took a snapshot of. You know that you're losing a lot of topsoil off of that ground. The last passage I'll read, and then I'll go into a more detailed discussion about the Kansas Water Vision Plan and what I think can be done to save the Ogallala Aquifer. The last passage I'll read illustrates sort of the mindset and what the problem is among farmers. I was living back in Kansas in the mid-'80s, farming with my father, and I was astounded by the amount of water that we were using. I had lived in the Mojave Desert prior to that and was very water conscious. And it just seemed, unbearable to watch that much water coming out of the ground. Then one day over dinner, my father fished a letter out of his lunchbox and handed it to me. It was from the Kansas Water Office, informing him that from now on, farmers would be fined for not reporting. We didn't know how much water we'd pumped that year. The water office hadn't made us install meters yet. So the only way to figure it out was by using the bills that the utility companies sent for each engine. Dividing the total gas usage by an estimate of how much the engines used in 1 hour, we could estimate the number of hours we pumped, then multiply by the engine's pumping rates. Dad said he tried to do all this himself, but he couldn't get his old noggin to do the numbers. I can still see the utility bills scattered over my kitchen table. I remember how confusing it was to discover that 2 of the wells shared a gas meter. But mostly I remember my shock when I totaled the numbers. We pumped 139 million gallons that season. Even though we irrigated more than 700 acres at the time, half of that amount went onto our 80-acre cornfield. That was more than 4,000 gallons of water for every bushel of corn we'd harvested. Hoping to prove that irrigated corn wasn't really profitable, I suggested I do a spreadsheet computing the cost of labor, fuel, depreciation, chemicals, seed, property taxes, and everything. Go ahead, Dad said, compute your heart out. The conclusion I reached, we barely broke even on corn until I factored in the subsidy checks, which put us $10,000 in the black. Are you satisfied, Dad asked. No, they're paying us to throw away water. And it's so irrational. The only reason people out here grow corn is because of the subsidies. But there's a corn surplus. The more we grow, the lower the price, so the more subsidies they have to give us. It's a vicious circle. That might be true, he allowed. But if the government paid Midwestern corn farmers to the east of us to grow corn, it wouldn't be fair to draw a line down the middle of the country and separate our poor, dry, old plains asses from those lucky so-and-sos who get rain. I sighed. Don't despair, Dad said. Big Daddy will put the plug in before it's too late. By Big Daddy, he meant the government. He had faith in this. It was the government's job to look out for the general good, preventing any serious harm individuals might cause in the pursuit of private gain. In the meantime, my daddy would raise his brows, cock his head at me, and smile with overstated cheer. Until then, I got mine. My father would say that just to get a rise out of me. Said it often, and it always did. He never failed to get a rise out of me. But really, he was not unlike any business person in any walk of life. He was doing what society condoned. It was legal. There were no regulations against it, and he was going to make the profits as long as he was allowed to do it. Politically, we have regressed a great deal since when President Richard Nixon proposed and created by executive order the Environmental Protection Agency. Can you even imagine a Republican president doing that now? In my opinion, this is a big disservice to farmers like my father. He always voted Republican, but he expected his government to govern and to protect the public interest. He didn't want to see the water disappear. The thing he loved to do most was fish in those rivers and streams that I showed you a map of earlier today. Since his time, there have been many small measures taken. All of the wells out there have meters on them now. They aren't appropriating any new water rights out there anymore. Sam Brownback ended the use it or lose it regulations, meaning that you can let your water sit there if you want to. You don't have to use it or lose it. We've all perhaps heard about the farmers in Thomas and Sheridan counties who voluntarily got together and cut back their own water usage by 20%. That's promising, but nowhere near, none of these measures is anywhere near enough to actually save the aquifer. Things have gotten worse since 2007 when the ethanol mandate went into effect. Corn got really profitable then. Now it's required that more and more ethanol be added to the nation's fuel supply each year. This resulted in a real boom in corn prices. So you can see from 2006, the corn price went from about $2 up to a peak in 2012 of over $8. In other words, at one point it quadrupled. Well, of course, farmers responded to that incentive, and they planted more corn. So you go from 2006, where you had around 80 million acres in the nation in corn, to a peak of about 97 million in 2012. In Kansas, 500,000 acres of additional corn were planted. This is really bad news for the aquifer because corn, other than alfalfa, is the thirstiest crop that we grow out there. It takes 14 inches of sprinkler irrigation water to grow 200 bushel corn. On the Texas High Plains, it requires 20 to 25 inches. And as a result, and I don't think this is directly a result of ethanol because it started happening before that, the depletion during the last 8 years of record, 2001 to 2008 inclusive, is about 32% of the cumulative depletion during the entire 20th century. So in just 8 years, we depleted more since we developed irrigation as early as the 1940s. This is despite the fact that center pivot irrigation sprinklers are 95% efficient. They're much more efficient at getting water to the crop than the flood irrigation systems that I was reading to you about just a minute ago. They were only 40 to 50% efficient. So it no longer takes 4,000 gallons to produce a bushel of corn if you want a 200 bushel yield. It takes more like 1,900 gallons to produce a bushel of corn now. But that's still a lot, and it's not really supportable, especially given the fact that we now know, there's almost no expert who will disagree with you about this, that ethanol is no big boon to the environment. It takes about a gallon of fossil fuel to make a gallon of ethanol. And there are a lot of environmental harms from the inputs that go into corn-based ethanol, but you heard a little bit about those earlier. Where does the nation's corn crop go other than to cars? Well, 40% goes to feed livestock, and out of 30% goes to ethanol, and then they get about 9% of dry distillers grain, which is also fed to livestock. About 8% is exported. The remainder, I haven't actually added this up, it looks like about 10%, goes to actually feed humans. But what are we getting out of it? Mostly we're getting high fructose corn syrup, which we all know. I mean, it's added to all of our foods, all of our processed foods, all of our Coca-Colas and everything that we eat and drink at a fast food restaurant, for instance. So it's not really good for us. So using such a huge portion of the nation's farmland for livestock feed really does present another issue. If we really want to feed the world, that is. I mean, that's what farmers always say, right? My parents were very proud of that. We're feeding the world. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently told us that we are going to need our groundwater aquifers just in order to augment the dryland crops that we used to be able to grow without the aid of irrigation. So it's going to take an inch or two of irrigation water to get a wheat crop through a drought or through a heat wave. That's a lot better than 14 inches that you use on corn. So by feeding the corn to cows instead of raising grass-fed beef, for instance, in some of those marginal lands that really should never have been taken out of grasslands to begin with, feeding corn to our cattle would be a much better use of those lands, and it would do more toward feeding the world than we're really doing right now. In fact, we're threatening the world's ability to eat, is what we're doing. Because when those droughts get longer and the heats get higher, we're going to need the aquifers that we are throwing away right now, all over the world. The aquifers are in trouble. This recent K-State study got, somehow I got out of line here. I hope I can find it. Oh, I was just going to say, the bottom line on this graph, this is hard to take in this short amount of time that we have, but if you look at the bottom right-hand figure, what that means is the protein in the corn that goes into the cow, you only get 5% of that protein out in the form of human feed, or human food, I guess I should say. This K-State study got a lot of play in 2013. It was in the news everywhere, all over the nation actually. 30% of the groundwater has been pumped, they told us, and another 39% will be depleted over the next 50 years, given existing trends. In other words, this is in Kansas. 70% of the water is going to be gone. This has long-term ecological and economic effects. And this chart that the K-State study also produced shows us what some of the alternatives might be. Okay, so it's hard to see. So in the top left-hand corner, what this is an illustration of is going from 0% cutback on groundwater use out of the aquifer now, all the way up to 80% cutback starting now. If you cut back 80%, what this line here along the bottom is showing you is that the water in the aquifer would stabilize and we would have Ogallala aquifer ad infinitum, indefinitely. At 60% cutback, we would still have Ogallala water, almost indefinitely. The chart is also showing us that if we chose to go on producing corn and beef, and corn-fed beef, then we would produce over time much more. In other words, the economy over the long term would benefit greatly with the greater the cutback, the greater the economy would benefit. That study also informed us that we have an opportunity to make changes with tremendous implications for future sustainability and livability, and the time to act will soon be past. And that is why Governor Brownback set up the Kansas Water Vision Team and mandated them to come up with a 50-year water vision for Kansas. And they went around the state over this last year, took a lot of input, and they came up with a preliminary discussion draft in July. And today, at the Governor's Water Conference in eastern Kansas, they are presenting their final draft. And then it will be up to the legislature as to whether or not to approve that draft. The first sample goal in that preliminary draft was conserve and extend the usable lifetime of the Ogallala Aquifer. But in the preliminary plan's examples of specific measurable goals, it suggests only this: achieve a 20% reduction in total consumptive use in the Ogallala Aquifer by 2065. That's a meager goal. By 2065, 70% of the water will already be gone. The K-State Studies forecast was that a 20% reduction now would take peak production of water and beef and corn to the 2070s, whereas right now we're looking at peak production in the 2040s. But that is still a very near-term, that's very near-term economic thinking. If you're going to satisfy yourself with a 30-year extension of an aquifer that has supported life on the plains for 13,000 years, we need to look more at the long term. As shown before, more extreme reductions could preserve the aquifer indefinitely, so that Kansas would indeed have a water future. The drafters are obviously more interested in the near term, and that is understandable given the political and economic forces at work right now in our country. But if we don't act decisively now, then Kansas farmers and the economy are headed for a crash landing. There's no way around it. We're going to run out of water if we keep going like we're going. And many farmers have already run out of water. The plan asks for suggestions for potential partners that are key to execution of the action items. It also asks for suggestions of partners who might help fund conservation of the aquifer. Well, what entity suggests itself as a potential partner, do you think? And what entity is not even mentioned in the plan? What entity has been underwriting the depletion of the aquifer by giving farmers incentives to grow a crop that is unsuited for the region? The federal government, you know, Big Daddy. But the government isn't even mentioned in this draft, the federal government. So with the federal government's help, we could easily engineer a soft landing rather than a crash landing for the economy and for the ecosystem. And those two words, by the way, are not diametrically opposed. They both have a root, that they share a root word from the Greek. Eco means home. The economy of home, the ecology, the integrated interrelatedness of life at home. If you take care of the interrelated life, then you can sustain life and you can have an income from it for a long time to come. Your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren can farm. Instead of incentives to grow corn, the federal government farm program should provide more incentives to grow drought-tolerant crops such as wheat and sorghum and the other experimental grains that are coming along now. Teff is one of them, canola, people have played with. There's a whole list. And they should provide incentives to return to grass-fed rather than feedlot beef. Return some of this marginal land to grass. And eliminate corn as a feedstock from the ethanol mandate. So if you think that's impossible, now that it's so entrenched, it's interesting to note that in Congress, in the Senate last year, there was a bipartisan bill put up by Senator Dianne Feinstein from California and Tom Coburn from Oklahoma, a Republican. It was called the Corn Ethanol Mandate Elimination Act of 2013. And it will be presented again this year, but I think it has even less likelihood of passing. I don't know for sure. But I do know that it's interesting to know, what do you think motivated Tom Coburn to do that? Well, he's from an oil and gas state, okay? It's also an aquifer state. But these interests are in opposition to each other right now because they don't want more ethanol. They want to sell more gas and oil. Well, those different forces are always competing with each other in any kind of political decision that's made. But I think it's our job as concerned citizens to, decide what our interest really is, align ourselves with that interest, and go try to negotiate. Go try to get something reasonable done. I'd like to show you a couple of additional images just at the end here. The first one you've already seen of me wading in the Republican River. It's a dismal, low state. And then this image. Hold on. This one. That's the bottom is super squishy, so I don't know.
Oh my God!
That was me swimming in the Republican River last October, and that's the reason I had to shout. The river was running high like that for the first time I'd seen since my childhood, and the reason it was doing that is because to settle the lawsuit between Kansas, Colorado, and Nebraska over the Republican River Compact, Colorado had gotten, with federal incentives, hundreds of farmers to close down their irrigation wells, and they had also opened the floodgates at Bonnie Dam, which is where I used to go fishing with my dad. We used to go boating there when I was a kid. But that was all Ogallala water. It was all spring-fed Ogallala water and was fed by the Republican River. I was told by a guy when I talked at K-State who was involved in this whole lawsuit that Colorado could not get enough farmers to agree to close their wells. So they had to resort to opening the floodgates at Bonnie Dam. But still, it was a combination of those two things that made it possible for me to swim in that river last October. Which means that if we buy back, using federal dollars, water rights from farmers, then some of those streams and rivers, if we do it soon enough, will run again in western Kansas. This is the cover of the paperback that's going to come out in August, but don't hesitate to buy a copy of the hardback. August is a long way away. It moved to speak out on behalf of life in Kansas and the water that supports it. Let your legislators know that you value not just the near term, but the long-term economy. And let them know that economy and ecology are inextricably linked. Let them know that you value the place, not just the money that can be mined from it along with the water. The money that will dry up along with the water. And ask them to lobby for changes in federal policy. So that's my spiel. my time, I don't know how that happens, but do we want to allow question and answers? Can we do that? So, any discussion or questions? Comments? Yeah.
It looks to me like Kansas is really in trouble either way. When you agree to cut back on irrigation enough to come to anywhere near a sustainable level for the aquifer, would totally devastate the Kansas economy.
Not with the federal incentives that I just talked about. I mean, that would certainly mitigate that. And think about it, I mean, all the farmers I knew in 2006 were doing well. They were doing quite well. They just weren't getting rich, you know? I mean, the ethanol mandate really spiked things up. There's no doubt about it. But do
Do
you,
you think
I
the
mean,
farmers in western Kansas as a whole are willing to give up that wealth to save the aquifer?
I don't know, that'll be interesting. I mean, that